Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a look at teenagers in the 50s with Randal Kleiser's Grease versus John Waters' Crybaby. And this was a fun, interesting one to get through. First off, we got Grease, one of the more iconic roles from John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John. It boasts a very iconic soundtrack as well. A lot of motherfuckers enjoy the film. It takes place in the 50s, and it's a musical, and usually musicals are pretty annoying, but there's not as much singing normally, and some of the songs are actually really good, and the sequences are fun and shit, and you got a lot of good supporting characters like Jeff Conway and Stockard Channing. They're really great. Sid Caesar, Eve Arden, all these motherfuckers, really make it kind of a fun movie, if not very annoying at times and stuff. But it's kind of, it's weird too, because none of these people really look like they're in high school, so that's kind of a joke in and of itself. It's just very grandiose, very like poppy, colorful, like the kind of shit they would make in the 50s. And and then they also try to throw some serious shit in there, like teen pregnancy and juvenile delinquency and racing and all this shit, but all in all, so the movie's really just kind of one big like frolicking joke type thing, and then that end sequence, the one that I want, that's really like badass, but then it ends on that very annoying fucking song where we're all happy together and shit, when everybody knows none of these people are gonna have happy lives. Granted, this is like fantasy land, but it's just even more irksome all the same. The movie didn't have to end all edgy. They could have ended the one that I want and have them like drive off flying in the car and shit, but the plot is kind of absurd. You got Travolta's character Danny meets Sandy, played by Olivia Newton-John, over the summer. They have a nice little summer fling, and then they go back to high school. That she ends up at his high school, and it kind of fucks with his whole image and stuff. So like the whole movie is just either one of them trying to conform to the other's image so they can like love each other and shit. Which is kind of bullshit in the end. But it all comes down to the leather and all that shit. But you also got Crybaby, where kind of the same premise. You got the juvenile delinquent guy, and the goody two shoes chick, but this one's not as like, weirdly, it's not as gay and it's not as silly as like Grease is, because you got Johnny Depp playing kind of the tough greaser part that John Travolta also plays in Grease, but Travolta kind of has like a fruitier way of trying to be a tough guy, and maybe that's the joke. But like Johnny Depp is like, he's a whiny ass bitch, he's one of those sensitive, almost predating the fucking emo phase, this little cry, with a little tear coming down, and all this shit, and and then he gets the girl, or he gets basically enamored with this rich proper girl who's got a very uptight grandmother. Both her parents are dead, so her grandmother's the one that takes care of her, and she's kind of what they call squares, and that Johnny Depp's crew is what they call drapes, but Johnny Depp's crew is like cool as fuck. It's Tracy Lords, Ricky Lake plays his sister, and Susan Terrell, who's fucking incredible, plays his grandmother, as well as Iggy Pop, who is her dude in the film. And the movie's pretty wild. Like, of course, it's John Waters, and this is very like tame John Waters, but you could tell like everybody's like having fun with this movie, and it's a little off the way at Hatchet Face, kind of looking like if Cyndi Lauper had got like the fuck beat out of her, and Willem Dafoe has a hilarious part as a prison guard in it, and the film's just filled with a lot of eccentricities and shit, and honestly the chicken scene at the end of Crybaby is way cooler than the little race sequence at the end of Grease. It's Randal Kleiser seems to be able to like capture exciting like imagery, but there's no like substance to it. Whereas like John Waters, he had an ability to like create his own little world and make it vibrant as hell, because this shit is fucking nuts, and he'll put like the oddest actors in it too, because like Patty Hearst plays Tracy Lord's mother in the film, and Yamik Stoll is Hatchet Face's mother, and and Joel the Alejandro, however the fuck you say his name, is in all those fucking Andy Warhol pictures. He's one of the parents, and it's this weird kind of like you know, the same kind of mockery of the juvenile delinquent films of the 50s. You know, it takes place in the mid 50s as well. And it does it in a way where it's like almost respectful of the genre, but also making fun of how absurd the times were, you know, because, you know, not to say that like John Waters is a socially conscious director, but he does kind of like make mention of a lot of social issues of the time in a very joking manner, and sometimes very, you know, blunt, and, you know, just not giving a fuck. You know, you know, that's the one thing about John Waters is his films. You know, you could tell like these are the films he wanted to make, and he gave zero fucks if anybody but him liked the fucking things. You know, and the music sequences are a lot. The music's not as annoying as it is in Grease. You know, where like in Grease half the songs are good. You know, all the shit in Crybaby's good, because it's like even the shit that they're making fun of, like the fucking like the Square talent show and shit. You know, that shit's even like, because it's funny. There's a lot of like comic moments. You know, Grease has that too, but you know, John Waters seems to understand comedy a little more than Randal Kleiser and the people that made Grease and stuff. Because a lot of times with Grease relies more on the cult of like the actors and stuff to like move the plot forward. Whereas like Crybaby, you know, you got all this ragtag band of misfits that just make this little badass movie and stuff. You know, it's rich, colorful, you know. And granted though, the credit to Grease, you know, it is the more iconic, and you know, the motherfuckers are actually doing the singing. But you know, musicals are bullshit anyways, because it's like, no, who the fuck ever just goes through a crisis and just starts singing to themselves? You know, maybe Broadway kids, but you know, normal ass people don't do that. Now I know it's the cinema, but you know, whatever makes a better movie. And honestly, if I'm wanting to watch a movie again, it would be Crybaby over Grease. You know, you have a lot more fun with it, and you don't feel like, you know, you've been just like jerked off in a bad way. So I guess this round's got to go to Crybaby. So that's another point for the 90s. Right now, for those keeping score, the score is now sitting at 20-22. 90s are up by 2 again. You know, they've been kicking ass recently. You know, 70s have been scrambling to catch up. So, you know, we'll see. But, you know, they put out their fair share of, like, garbage, you know, just like the 90s did. And the 90s would have these little gems that would surprise you. You know, Crybaby is just a fun fucking time, you know. And even, like, Susan Terrell is just fucking badass. You know, her shit is so, every fucking like comedic sequence and shit, you know, it's just because it's not really trying to be as funny as it is, but even from the fucking line delivery, especially a lot of hatchet faces shit, is fucking hilarious. And you know, these actors are more believable in their parts because they honestly look young enough to be like the characters they're playing and shit. So 2022, 90s are up by 2. You got to give it up for John Waters, man, the Pope of Trash, and it made better movies. You know, ironically enough, Crybaby's less gay than Grease, and so, and plus Johnny Depp is a way better actor than John Travolta. Even though, you know, John Travolta's no slouch, but Johnny Depp is one of the greatest actors, not just of his generation, but of all time. And but also neither one of them have an Oscar, so you know, that's there's a lot of travesties in the cinema and shit. So, but like I said, if I've said anything wrong or anything you disagree with or would like to add, you know, let me know in the comments. I don't give a fuck. You know, I have no life. That's why I keep doing these videos and stuff. Plus, you know, this is what obsession and insanity looks like. You know, I got to know what the fuck is what the outcome's going to be. You know, that's why you keep seeing these bonus rounds pop up. There'll be another main event next week, Badlands versus True Romance. But until then, there'll be more of these and stuff. And if you got any ideas on collaborations, you know, this is just kind of a doctoral thesis, you know, rough draft of that shit. So, you know, give it up for the 50s, you know, big nostalgic period in the 70s. And, you know, but oddly enough, the motherfuckers in the 90s did it better. So I could have been gaslighting myself this whole time. We shall see.